Hey everyone, I'm coming to you from our flat here in Rome, Italy. Now, last summer I went to Greece and Turkey to walk the footsteps of Apostle Paul, and amazingly this summer I'm able to continue my journey here in Rome. So today I thought I would share with you about Paul's journey here to Rome. So his first visit was in 60 AD. Now, at that time, Rome already had a growing Christian community. Of course, these were the recipients of Paul's letter to the Romans. So the question is, where did these Roman Christians come from? Well, if we go back to Acts 2, it says that the Roman Jews, they traveled to Jerusalem for Pentecost. Little did they know how significant this Pentecost would be. If you remember, the disciples and the other Christ followers, they were gathered in an upper room in Jerusalem when suddenly they heard a sound like the blowing of a violent wind. Tongues of fire descended and they rested upon each one of them. Well, the disciples, they began speaking in other tongues, and these God-fearing Jews from other nations, including Rome, heard them speaking in their own language. So these Roman Jews, they spoke Latin, and when they heard the disciples speaking in Latin, it actually intrigued them, especially because Galileans were known to speak only Aramaic. So these Roman Jews, they were among the crowd that listened to Peter's gospel message explaining the promised Holy Spirit. And it's likely that some of the Roman Jews were among the 3,000 that were saved and baptized that day. So they would have been the ones to bring the gospel message back to Rome when they returned. And this is most likely how Christianity began to spread in Rome. Well, then if we fast forward and we go to Acts 23, we read that Paul was tried by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. See, there was this great uproar because Paul knew exactly how to stir the pot. He addressed the Sanhedrin by saying, "I'm a Pharisee, and I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead." Well, this was a strategic move on his part because he knew it could create this vigorous debate between the Pharisees, who believed in the resurrection, and the Sadducees, who did not. Well, this debate became so heated that the Roman commander removed Paul from the scene, and he placed him in barracks. It was then that Jesus appeared to Paul. And this is in Acts 23:11. It says, "The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, 'Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.'" Well, if we look at the Greek word for the phrase "take courage," it's tharseo, which means to be of good cheer or comfort or to take courage. Interestingly, this word is only used 8 times in the New Testament, and every time it's only used by Jesus. It was one of his common phrases, and I think no doubt because he often saw fear and despair and worry in people. So by saying tharseo, Jesus was giving them an entirely different perspective than the one they had been focusing on. So by saying this to Paul, Jesus brought confirmation to the desire in Paul's heart to visit Rome. It also was a way that Jesus brought encouragement to Paul. See, Jesus' words actually assured Paul that he was going to make it out alive from Jerusalem. And this would prove to be a powerful word that Paul held on to throughout the difficult journey to Rome. See, Paul sailed to Rome to stand trial before Caesar, and he was held as a prisoner, but Luke and Aristarchus actually were able to travel with him. Now, it's possible that Aristarchus was a prisoner also, and Luke may have actually signed up to be the physician on board as a way to accompany Paul, but it was definitely a treacherous journey. See, in Paul's day, sailing after September 15th was considered dangerous. Sailing after December 11th was considered suicidal. And we read in Acts 27:9, Luke mentions it was after the fast, which actually refers to the Day of Atonement. So in AD 59, the Day of Atonement was October 5th, so they were clearly in the danger zone for sailing. So they landed in Fair Havens, which was a harbor in Crete, and the sailors determined it wasn't a good place to winter. But Paul warned them it was not advisable to continue because he had received a vision that their voyage would be disastrous. In fact, there would be great loss, both of cargo and the ship. But the men, they didn't heed his warning. Instead, they all thought it would be better to harbor for the winter in Phoenix because it was a more protected harbor. So they set sail, and at first it seemed like the winds were cooperating, but then this northeaster blew in with these hurricane-force winds. The journey became so difficult the men stopped eating for 14 days because they were afraid of dying. Well, thankfully, Paul had received a visitation from an angel assuring them that none would perish. And we read about this in Acts 27:23, which says, "Last night an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you.'" Well, Paul encouraged everyone to eat because they definitely needed the strength to survive the journey. And then shortly thereafter, they actually ran aground off the shore of Malta. So some had to swim ashore, and then those who couldn't swim actually used planks to float on, but everyone arrived safely. And there, the people of Malta actually welcomed them, and God used Paul powerfully to release miraculous healing to all the sick on the island. So he stayed there for 3 months, and then they set sail for Italy on an Alexandrian ship with the figureheads of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. Now these were the deities of the underworld and the gods of navigation. They were the patron gods of the vessel that Paul sailed on to make his way to Rome. Then after landing in several ports in Italy, they disembarked in Puteoli, and they walked on foot along the Via Appia on the way to Rome. The Roman Christians, they were so excited to meet Paul that they traveled about 40 miles to meet up with Paul on Via Appia, and that greatly encouraged him. So that's a bit about Paul's journey to Rome. Hey everyone, I thought I'd show you a little bit of my surroundings right now. And it turns out that we chose the hottest week in Italy to be here, the hottest of the entire year. So I'm going to try not to melt during this video, but I want to share with you some interesting connections about the founding of Rome and the Edomites. And for those of you who have heard me talk about red being the calling card of the Nephilim agenda, you may remember that it's linked to the Edomites. Well, as it turns out, Esau and the Edomites were instrumental in the storyline of the Nephilim agenda all throughout history. And in my book, The Roots of the Federal Reserve, I uncover an interesting plot to the founding of Rome, and I want to share this with you. So now, in most history books, you'll find the legend that Rome was founded in 753 BC by two brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were demigods. Well, these two brothers got into this huge argument over who would rule the city, and Romulus actually killed his brother and named the city after himself. So that's what's in history books. But Isaiah 34 actually provides a different perspective and it's an interesting connection between Edom and Rome, one that's actually easily overlooked if it weren't for Clark's commentary. So Clark quotes Rabbi Kimchi, who spoke about Isaiah 34 and said that it tells of the future destruction of Rome, which was called Bozrah. Now Kimchi said that Bozrah was a great city of the Edomites and that the majority of the Romans were Edomites, including Emperor Constantine and all the emperors after him. Now what's curious about Kimchi's perspective is that Isaiah 34 actually makes no reference to Rome. Yet it seems he draws this substantial connection between Edom and Rome. So why is that? Well, I believe in part it's due to Edom being considered a type of Antichrist. See, numerous eschatological scholars believe the Antichrist will arise out of Rome. So it's possible Kimchi had this view as well. But if we examine further the Jewish tradition connecting Edom with Rome, we come across a useful resource written by William Beeston in 1858. It's called The Roman Empire, the Empire of the Edomite. Now there's valuable information in this resource that's actually been silent in our history books for about the past 2 centuries. And of course we know, unfortunately, that history can be rewritten for the benefit of optics. Well, Beeston, he was this scholar who presented an alternative historical account for the founding of Rome. You see, he studied etymology, rabbinic tradition, and even Bible prophecy, which led him to conclude that the Edomites founded Rome. Now, in his research, he found a reference to the translation of Lamentations 4:22 by a 16th century Hebraist named Johann Buchstorff. Now, Buchstorff, he was highly respected, and he was known as the master of the rabbis. He actually translated the Targum passage of Lamentations 4:22 as saying, "And at that time I will punish your iniquities, wicked Rome, built in Italy and filled with crowds of Edomites." Well, this was quite a find for Beeston, but he needed to corroborate Buchstorff's translation. So in his research, it actually led him to a copy of the first edition of the Biblia Hebraica Rabbinica. This Bible was printed in the 1517. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I geek out about. As a researcher, to find the original sources dating back several centuries is literally like finding a pot of gold. So Beeston, he found a copy of this Bible in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. And when he looked up Lamentations 4:22, it was translated just as Buchstorff had done. So Beeston concluded that this Bible was a genuine translation of the Targum, and the Targum is the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Targum was most likely translated by a rabbi during Jesus' day. Okay, so let me connect some of the dots then. Rabbi Kimchi asserted that Rome was Edom and that Constantine was an Edomite. The Jewish Targum linked Edom with Rome, and Buchstorff's translation of Lamentations 4:22 links Rome with Edom, and Beeston's research corroborated Buchstorff's translation. So if we pull all these clues together, it actually points us to the idea that Rome and Edom became one and the same entity. And if this is true, then we should expect to see some similarities between Edom and Rome. Now, Edom was bloodthirsty. It was the arch enemy of the Israelites. The Edomites, among which were the Amalekites, used brutal acts of violence towards the Israelites because of their deep-seated hatred towards Jacob. The Edomites engaged in genocide. Likewise, Rome was considered one of the most bloodthirsty empires in history, and we see evidence of this by the brutality of the Roman legions, but even more so by the Roman games held in the Colosseum. See, Roman citizens, they were entertained by observing the ever-increasing grotesque mauling of humans by these ravenous beasts. The bloodier the event, the more riveted the spectators were. So, today, I just wanted to bring you some of these interesting bits of history regarding the Edomites potentially being the founders of Rome. And stay tuned for more videos. Hey guys, here is some footage from our adventures up the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. And I have to tell you, getting up there is not for the faint of heart. I mean, we first stood in lines for over an hour in the stifling heat. I have never sweat so bad in my life. And then we made the mistake of going into the basilica first, not realizing that that meant we could no longer have access to the stairs to the dome. In fact, they wanted us to buy another ticket to get up the stairs, even though we had already bought the ticket. So we're like, oh my goodness, now what? So I just prayed. I was like, Lord, give us an Isaiah 30:21 experience, which says, whether you turn to the right or the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. Well, sure enough, the Lord directed us where we could enter. So we blended in with this other family that allowed us to get past the entrance to the stairs. Now the stairs, there are 500 stairs to get to the top. And the further up you get, the smaller the enclosure. The last 50 steps or so are this skinny spiral staircase. And again, it is so hot. But I have to say, the payoff was worth it, because check out these views. They are absolutely stunning. Not to mention, it's a high place in which I could carry out the assignment the Lord gave me. So we made declarations of the supremacy of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who came in the flesh. We interceded. We commissioned angels. We offered up worship in spirit and in truth. And here is a view of the Pope's audience hall from above. And the inside of this building looks like the head of a reptilian. And the symbolism is so clear. See, the Pope sits under the head of this reptilian as a sign of his allegiance in the Seed War. And so we were able just to pray over that thing. And in a moment, you'll see St. Peter's Square with its massive circumpunct, which, for those of you that don't know, a circumpunct is a circle with a dot. And the origin of it dates back to the sun worship of Ra in ancient Egypt. See, it's a universal symbol of false worship. So there it is. And so this obelisk that was erected in St. Peter's Square in 41 AD, it actually once stood in Heliopolis, which was the ancient center of Egyptian sun worship. So the circumpunct is a phallic symbol. The obelisk represents the erect penis pointing toward the womb of the sun, which pagans believed to be the source of life. And for those of you who read my book, you'll understand the significance of the circumpunct in advancing the Nephilim agenda. And for me, knowing what I know now about the Nephilim and how active they are underneath the Vatican, it was so significant for me to be there and to have a chance just to speak the word of God over the land and to offer up worship in spirit and in truth. It was so significant and meaningful. So anyways, I just wanted to share all of that with you. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video. I'm standing outside the Mamertine prison, the place where Apostle Paul and Peter were at one time imprisoned. And during Paul's day, this prison was called the Tullianum, that's what it is. It was similar to what we think of Alcatraz, only much, much worse. And, it was for hardened criminals. There were actually 2 levels to this prison. The lower level had a cistern about 12 feet below the ground, and it was described by historians as a dark and terrifying place with a hideous stench. And I was just in that place, and I will send pictures later. It's where they dropped prisoners to starve to death. So the Tullianum was connected to Rome's main sewer, and the dead bodies of the prisoners were dumped into the Tiber River. Now, it's thought that Peter and Paul spent 9 months imprisoned here, but it's unclear if this is legend or fact. But as I was in there, I discovered that there's a column from the 1st century AD in the Mamertine Prison Museum, and it's believed to be the one that Paul and Peter were actually chained to. And they get this information from a detail mentioned on one of the Roman stones engraved located in the Tullianum, or Tullianum, I think it's called. So being here, I don't know, I am just really struck by all that Paul endured for the sake of spreading the gospel message. And I think it's really challenged me to endure extreme temperatures. We've had tons of crowds here, long lines. The bus rides are almost unbearable because they're packed full of people. But remembering what Paul went through really helped me endure situations without complaining, and it's really helped me realize that I'm such a pansy. But here's some of the surrounding location, and I'm gonna, as I mentioned, I took some video of the prison that I'll post later because I didn't want to record inside. It was a sacred area. But that's all for now. See you in my next video. Here I am in the Tullianum, which is the lower portion of the prison where Paul and Peter were chained to a column for 9 months. It just was an incredibly moving experience to be there, realizing that no matter what the circumstances are, they were able to walk in joy. They worshiped. They shared the gospel message with the other prisoners, leading some of them to Jesus. And again, I'm deeply impacted in realizing how much I complain about life. If circumstances don't go my way, or if a situation isn't optimal, it's just so easy to complain. And being in these locations, watching or just understanding all that Paul went through has deeply impacted me. Okay, now I'm at the Roman Forum, and I want to share a bit of what the city of Rome was like during Paul's day. So obviously it was the capital of the Roman Empire. It was located on 7 hills, and it was celebrated, of course, for, its impressive public buildings, its aqueducts, its baths, its theaters, and its roads. Now, the Roman roads, they were quite impressive. They were a major thoroughfare that led from distant provinces within the empire to the city of Rome. So Apostle Paul would have traveled these Roman roads frequently in his missionary journeys, especially Via Egnatia, which I was on last year in Greece. So Via Egnatia was constructed in the 2nd century BC, and it ran from Constantinople to the Adriatic Sea, and then travelers would have to finish their voyage to Italy by boat. So thinking about Paul, once landing on shore, Paul walked along the Via Appia, which ran from the south of Italy to Rome. And the Colosseum, which is over here, had not yet been built during Paul's day. But shortly after he died, Vespasian began construction on the Colosseum using the loot from the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, Capitoline Hill was a prominent location in Rome, as was the temples of Jupiter and Juno. And then Palatine Hill was adorned with imperial palaces, including Nero's Golden House. So both I have a problem saying that today. Capitoline Hill and Palatine Hill actually overlooked the Forum, which is where we're at now. And in the 1st century, Rome had nearly 1 million people, including 50,000 Jews. Now, the Roman Forum was the hub of the Roman Empire, and it was from this location that the famous martyrdom of Christians took place. Down the middle of the Forum was the Temple of Saturn, and let's see if I can locate that. It could still be seen today, portions of it, and this was the pagan temple of sun worship, and it's the oldest monument in the Roman Forum. Also located inside was a mile marker that allowed people to understand that all roads lead to Rome. See, all roads were considered to begin at this monument, and all distances in the Roman Empire were measured by their distance to it. So there's a lot here, as you can see. I just wanted to bring you some tidbits of information. Signing off for now. Hey guys, I'm now here at the Circus Maximus, which was an ancient Roman stadium for entertainment like horse and chariot races. At capacity, this stadium could hold about 150,000 people. And I thought to understand the significance of this location during Paul's day, it would be helpful if I gave a brief history of the Roman emperors during the New Testament times. And I'm just going to show you a little bit around here. So Caesar Augustus, he was the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' birth. And we know that from Luke chapter 2, which tells us that Augustus Caesar ordered a census to be taken of every Roman citizen. Well, Caesar Augustus, his birth name was actually Octavian, and he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Well, in 27 BC, Octavian was honored by the Roman Senate with the title Augustus, meaning revered or more than human. So that's where Augustus Caesar got his name. Now, Augustus died in 14 AD, and he was succeeded by his son Tiberius. In Luke chapter 3, it tells us that John the Baptist began preaching during the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and that would have been in like 26 and 27 AD. Then Tiberius was followed in 37 AD by his great-nephew Gaius, who they actually called Caligula because of the little boots he wore as a child. So Caligula was popular at first, but he developed an illness that led to mental instability, and he began a reign of terror. Caligula was then succeeded in 41 AD by his uncle Claudius, and Claudius invaded Britain in 43 AD. Well, when Claudius was emperor in 44 AD, at that time they had a famine, and that prompted Saul and Barnabas to take a gift from the church in Antioch to the Christians in Jerusalem. Then Claudius was in 49 AD, he expelled all the Jews from Rome, and the Roman historian Tacitus recorded that it was because the Jews were always fighting about Christos, or Christ. And so there was this ongoing conflict between Jewish Christians and traditional Orthodox Jews. It's actually the reason why Priscilla and Aquila were expelled from Rome, and they ended up in Corinth where they met Paul. Well, then Claudius, he was followed by his 17-year-old stepson Nero in 54 AD. And Paul had appealed to Emperor Nero in 57 AD, which set the stage for his journey to Rome. He finally was acquitted after a hearing before the emperor in 62 AD. Now, Nero later became this brutal psychopath, and he blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, and that's what brings us to this location. On July 18, 64 AD, a fire broke out in a shop at the northeast end of the Circus Maximus, and it rapidly spread, consuming portions of Nero's palace. Well, Nero blamed the Christians for the fire, and that began the mass arrest and execution of Christians, and it's thought that Paul died in these executions. The execution of Christians actually became sport and entertainment to the Romans. I mean, it was so brutal. Some of the Christians, they were sewn up in the skins of wild beasts. They were eaten to death by ravenous dogs. Others were fastened to crosses and set on fire to serve as living torches at night, which just sounds incredibly brutal. Well, Clement of Rome actually wrote of Paul as being among the great multitude of the elect that were gathered up to be tortured. And there's little doubt among scholars that Clement was actually referring to the persecution under Nero. Now, I'll discuss the martyrdom of Paul in an upcoming video, but I just wanted to show you a little bit of footage of Circus Maximus, where it all started for the persecution of the Christians. Okay, see you in my next video. Well, this is our last morning here in Rome. We fly out to England and then on to Spain, so I'll pick up on the trail of Paul when I get to Spain. I thought this morning I would share about how Paul most likely died. So if you remember, when Paul first arrived in Rome, he spent 2 years living on his own in a rented house. And from there, he welcomed everyone who would come to visit him. And we see that in Acts 28. Well, the early church believed that Paul was released by Caesar and acquitted of all charges. And it was believed that he returned to preaching for several years before he was imprisoned again and sentenced to death. And his imprisonment, that would have been the Mamertine prison that I was in the other day. So he may have even reached Spain, which is interesting. Eusebius recorded that after pleading his cause, Paul was sent to preach. Then after his second visit to the city, he finished his life in martyrdom. Well, the first letter of Clement, written from Rome in 96 AD, actually speaks about Paul pointing the way to the prize of endurance. He says 7 times he bore chains. He was sent into exile and stoned. He served as a herald in both the East and the West, and then he received the noble reputation for his faith. He also taught righteousness to the whole world and came to the limits of the West, bearing his witness before the rulers. So Clement says he was set free from this world and transported up to the holy place, having become the greatest example of endurance. Well, given that Clement was writing from Rome, some scholars think take this to mean that he was describing the martyrdom of Paul, and that it was taking place here in Rome. Now, Tertullian was the first to clearly connect Rome as being the location of Paul's martyrdom. He talked about having been in Rome, from which there comes even into our own hands the very authority of apostles themselves into the church, on which apostles poured forth all their doctrine along with their blood, and where Peter endures a passion like his Lord's, where Paul wins his crown in death. So by the end of the first century, we have an even more clear picture given the writings of these early Christian fathers and the apologists. They write that, they've seen the presence of Peter and Paul in Rome grow from not having been there at the founding, according to the New Testament, to being named the pillars of the church, who enjoined the Roman Christian community and who founded the church with their blood. Well, in the 4th century, Eusebius, a friend of Constantine, who actually attended the Council of Nicaea, he was asked to write an ecclesiastical history of the Christian church from the time of Jesus up through Constantine. So he writes about Peter actually being hung upside down on a cross, and he writes that Paul fulfilled the gospel of Christ from Jerusalem all the way to Illyria and was martyred in Rome under Nero. He describes that Paul was beheaded in Rome, and at the time of his writings, there were actual burial plots with Peter and Paul's name on it. So Eusebius writes that both were martyred at the same time, and this is confirmed by Dionysius, the bishop of Corinth, in a correspondence with the Romans, in which he says that Peter and Paul are the foundations of the Romans and Corinthians, both of them taught together in Corinth and also in Italy. And he writes that both were martyred in the same place at the same time. Now, some scholars think that there's no confirmation of Paul's death before Nero ordered the execution of Christians, and it's widely accepted that Paul's life ended in Rome in martyrdom. So tradition suggests that it was during the time of the great persecution of Christians in Rome following the Great Fire in AD 64. And that was 2 years after the latest probable date for Caesar to hear Paul's case. So the timing of his release from house arrest and his death actually leaves room for Paul to have made a possible trip to Spain. And I'll pick up on that trail when I get there. Thanks, everyone. Signing off from Rome. Good morning. I'm coming to you from Spain. I'm continuing walking the footsteps of Apostle Paul, so I wanted to share some things with you. Now, first of all, we don't know for sure whether Paul made it to Spain, and that's because, unfortunately, Roman Emperor Diocletian, he destroyed such a great number of Christian documents that actually would have confirmed Paul's trip to Spain. But there are enough clues to be relatively confident that he made it here. So I want to help us piece together these clues. Now, first, we know that Paul expressed his intentions to travel to Spain in Romans 15. See, as he was writing to the Roman Christians, he told them that he hoped to see them on his way to Spain. And at the time of writing the book of Romans, Paul was actually on his way to Jerusalem. He was bringing aid to the Christians there. Once he finished that assignment, his plan was to head to Spain. Well, of course, his plans were delayed when he was arrested in Jerusalem, and then he appealed to stand trial before Caesar. So when we look at the history of all of this, it's likely that Paul was released by Nero in 63 AD, and his death wasn't until 67 AD. So that would have left some time for him to travel to Spain. Several early Christian documents actually mention Paul's trip to Spain. In 96 AD, Clement of Rome, who actually was a disciple of Paul, he wrote a letter to the Corinthians. And in this letter, he mentions Paul's trip to Spain by saying, having taught righteousness unto the whole world and having reached the farthest bounds of the West. Well, the Roman phrase, the farthest bounds of the West, actually referred to Spain, and more specifically, the Iberian Peninsula. Well, so when Clement wrote this from Rome, the farthest bounds of the West would have been further west than Rome. And of course, Spain fits this description. Then we have the apocryphal writing called the Acts of Peter. And this actually provides us with even more confirmation because in chapters 1 through 3, it speaks of Paul's departure from Rome to Spain. Then we have the Mamertine canon, and this lends further evidence. This document is a fragment dating back to the 2nd century AD, and it contains the earliest, most complete list of the books in the New Testament. So in this Mamertine, it actually explains that in the book of Acts, Luke only included the events he witnessed firsthand. And this is evidenced by his omission of the suffering of Peter, as well as there being no mention of Paul's journey to Spain after he was released from house arrest in Rome. Now, also we have the writings of the early church fathers and apologists that provide us with the rest of our clues. Cyril of Jerusalem, he lived in the 4th century. He actually makes reference in his writings that Paul carried the earnestness of his preaching to Spain. Then we have Chrysostom, the 5th century Archbishop of Constantinople. He was considered to be the most talented preacher in Christian history. In fact, his name in Greek means golden-mouthed because he was so eloquent as a preacher. He recorded that Paul went to Spain after he was in Rome. Then Jerome, the 4th and 5th century scholar ordained in Antioch, he translated 39 books of the Old Testament and 4 Gospels into Latin. He also reported that Paul made it to Spain. So we have Clement of Rome, Cyril of Jerusalem, Chrysostom of Constantinople, and Jerome of Antioch, all documenting that Paul made it to Spain. Now, something else to consider is that by the middle of the 3rd century, the Christian church in Spain was actually mature and well organized. There were bishops representing every province in Spain who attended this church council meeting held near Granada in 306 AD. So there were 43 bishops and presbyters at that time. And given that, it suggests that the gospel had arrived in Spain at an early date, which would have matched when Paul most likely came to Spain. Now, interestingly, Kenneth Betting from the Talbot School of Theology, he's actually identified a possible timeline for Paul's 4th missionary journey. So he suggests that Paul appeared before Nero sometime during his 2-year house arrest, which most scholars agree with. He was then released by Nero and then traveled to Spain. Well, on his return from Spain, perhaps Paul sailed to the island of Crete, where he ministered alongside Titus. And then from Crete, it's really unclear all the places he may have visited, but at some point, we know he was arrested once again and imprisoned in Rome during the winter. And this would have been his imprisonment in the Mamertine prison, which I was in Rome. So it's likely that Paul wrote his 2nd letter to Timothy from Mamertine prison. In fact, 2 Timothy 4:16 says, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure. I've fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." Well, as Paul wrote this, I think he sensed that the time of his execution was near. Scholars believe that Paul, being a Roman citizen, was beheaded because it was a quick execution that avoided prolonged torture, and his execution probably took place in the Roman Forum. Well, I hope you have enjoyed my journeys following the footsteps of Paul, and it's been so much fun to dig into the Word of God and allow Scripture to come alive in these places. So I'm signing off from Spain. Adios.